You own nothing, Renee. Without me, you have absolutely nothing. Stay in your lane.
You are right, Marcus.
She had been cooking since 5 that morning. Baked chicken seasoned with herbs she grew on her own kitchen windowsill. Cornbread pressed into the cast-iron skillet her grandfather had given her the summer she turned 13. Collard greens that had been sitting low and slow on the back burner since before the sun came up, filling every room in that house with a warmth that should have meant something. She had set the table with the good linen. She had dressed her children. She had worn her good earrings. And she had no idea that the man she had spent 9 years loving, 9 years cooking for, 9 years building a home alongside, had spent the entire week planning exactly how he was going to humiliate her at that table. In front of his mother. In front of his brothers. In front of her own children. And in front of the woman he had been sleeping with for the past 2 years. What her husband Marcus did not know, what none of them sitting at that table knew, was that 3 days before that Sunday dinner, a phone call had come through on her cell phone. For minutes and 11 seconds long. From a law firm in Atlanta called Carter and Associates. And what the attorney told her in those 4 minutes had rearranged something inside of Renee Johnson that was never, not ever, going back to where it had been. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand what Renee Johnson was carrying into that Sunday dinner, you have to understand who she was before Marcus, before the marriage, before the slow and deliberate erosion of everything she had built inside herself. You have to go back further than the argument or the humiliation or the quiet devastation of watching your husband look through you like you are furniture he has already decided to replace. You have to go all the way back to a small town outside of Savannah, Georgia, where a little girl with 2 braids and bare feet used to sit on a wooden porch at the end of long summer evenings and receive an education that no school in the country could have given her. Her name then was Renee Marie Washington. She was the daughter of Celestine Washington, who died of a fast and merciless illness when Renee was just 6 years old. A loss so complete, so total, that it reorganized the entire geography of her childhood. She was old enough to remember the particular smell of her mother's kitchen on Sunday mornings. Old enough to remember the sound of her laugh in certain bright rooms. Old enough to carry the memory of what it felt like to be held the way only a mother holds a child. But not old enough to hold on to much more than that. And so she had been raised by the only person left in the world who understood the full weight of what that little girl had lost, and who had decided without ceremony and without complaint that she would not carry it alone. His name was Samuel Washington. He was her grandfather. And from the moment Celestine passed and Renee came to live with him on that Georgia property with the red dirt roads and the tall pecan trees, and the wide wooden porch that faced open sky, he had been the fixed point around which her entire world rotated. Samuel Washington was not a man who announced himself. He stood 6 feet and 2 inches tall and moved through every room and every conversation with the slow, deliberate certainty of a person who already knows where he is going and has no need to rush in getting there. His hands were enormous, calloused deep in the palms from decades of real physical work, not the performance of labor, but the actual thing. Building, planting, repairing, improving. The land around him was not just property to Samuel. It was testimony. It was the material record of what a black man in the American South could accomplish when he refused, absolutely and completely, to accept the ceiling that the world around him had agreed to build above his head. He had purchased his first parcel of land in rural Georgia in 1968, at a time when what he was doing required a particular kind of courage that most people alive today would struggle to fully appreciate. Black families across the South had been building wealth through land during that era, their ancestors going through immense sacrifice specifically so that children and grandchildren would have something, specifically so the next generation would not have to go through as much as they did. Samuel had understood that truth at the cellular level. He had not bought that first parcel of Georgia land for himself. He had bought it for people who had not yet been born. He expanded quietly across the years. A second parcel in 1973, a third in 1979. In the same tradition as black landowners of that era who amassed hundreds of acres during the Jim Crow years, land ownership meant power and self-sufficiency in a way that employment under someone else never could. Samuel understood this not as philosophy, but as practical strategy. He made investments in small companies that nobody in his immediate circle had thought to look at twice. He worked with a law firm in Atlanta, a firm called Carter and Associates, for over 35 years, and he trusted them with everything. He said once, sitting on that porch with young Renee beside him, that a good lawyer was worth more than any single investment because a good lawyer protected all the others. He said it the way he said everything important, not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly, the way a man speaks when he is not trying to persuade anyone, just stating what he knows to be true. He was not a wealthy presenting man. He drove the same truck for 16 years. He wore the same 3 pairs of work boots on rotation. He did not discuss money at dinner tables or in church pews or anywhere that the wrong ears might be listening. He had learned early that for any black man building something real, visibility was a risk, and silence was sometimes the most powerful protective strategy available. So he built in silence. He planned in silence. He protected in silence. And he raised Renee in that silence, in that particular and intentional quiet, teaching her things that would take her decades to fully understand. He taught her about land, what it meant to own it, what it meant for your children that you owned it, and what it had cost black people in America across generations not to own it. He told her about patience. Not patience as passivity, not patience as the quiet swallowing of things that should not be swallowed, but patience as the deliberate and strategic management of time. Knowing when to move. Knowing when to be still. He told her that the loudest person in any room was almost always the most afraid, and that the quietest one, the one sitting still while everyone else was performing, was usually the most ready. He pressed a small brass compass into her palm one August evening when she was 10 years old, sitting beside him on that porch as the Georgia sky went deep pink and gold over the treeline. He told her it had belonged to his own father, and that his father had told him the same thing he was now telling her. That a person who knows their direction does not need to announce where they are going. They simply go. Renee had worn that compass on a thin chain around her neck every day of her life from that evening forward. Through high school in Savannah. Through her undergraduate years at Spelman College in Atlanta, where she studied social work and carried that compass under her shirt against her collarbone like a secret that only she and Samuel shared. Through graduate school. Through her first real job at a community development nonprofit in Atlanta, where she worked with families trying to access resources that the system had spent generations working to keep out of their reach. She had been good at that work in the way that people are good at things that come from somewhere real inside them, not performance, not ambition alone, but genuine investment. She had met Marcus Johnson at a fundraising dinner for that nonprofit when she was 28 years old. She had not been looking. That was the thing she would think about years later, sitting in a kitchen that had gone quiet and cold, how she had not been looking, and how that had felt like a sign at the time, like the thing coming to you without you chasing it was proof that it was meant. Marcus had been 32. He had a civil engineering job with a firm in Atlanta that he was genuinely good at. He had a warmth about him in those years, an ease, a way of making the people around him feel like the room had gotten better since he walked in. He was attentive. He was funny in the specific way that makes you feel like you are the only one in on the joke. He had told her on their third date that she was the most self-possessed person he had ever met. He had said it with a genuine admiration that made her look away, and he had reached across the table and said he meant it, that he had never known a woman so completely rooted in herself. She had believed him. She had every reason to believe him then. They married 2 years later in a ceremony at a small church outside of Savannah, not far from Samuel's land, with the old pecan trees visible through the chapel windows and Samuel himself sitting in the front row in a new suit, watching his granddaughter with eyes that held everything a person feels when they have lived long enough to see the seeds they planted begin to bear the fruit they always hoped for. Renee had danced with him that night, slow and easy, the way they had danced on his porch to old records when she was small. He had held her hands in both of his enormous, calloused palms and said into her hair, quietly, just for her, "You are the best thing I ever did, baby girl. Everything I built for you." She had held on tight and told him she loved him. She did not yet understand the full weight of what he had just said. The first 4 years were good. Not the performed goodness of two people trying to convince each other and the world around them that they had made the right choice. The actual thing. A home in a quiet neighborhood on the southwest side of Atlanta that Renee had researched for 3 months before they made an offer, close to good schools, close to the community resources she cared about, close enough to the highway that Marcus could get to his firm without the commute grinding him down before the day began. She had put the mortgage in her name because her credit score and her debt-to-income ratio were cleaner, and the bank had offered a better rate. Marcus had not objected. They had signed the paperwork together at the dining room table on a Tuesday evening with takeout containers pushed to one side, and she had filed the documents in the gray folder she kept for important papers and set it on the shelf and thought nothing more of it. It was a practical decision. It was a Tuesday. She could not have known that Tuesday would matter enormously 9 years later in a way that would leave an attorney's office absolutely silent. Their first child came in year 2. A daughter they named Chloe, who arrived in the world already seeming to understand something, with wide, watchful eyes and a calmness to her that made the nurses in the delivery room comment on it. Their second child came in year 4. A son they named Deshaun, who was everything his sister was not at birth: loud, certain, demanding attention with the full force of his small body from the very first hour. Renee loved them with the complete and unreserved love of a woman who had spent her childhood understanding what it meant to lose a mother young, and who had decided somewhere deep inside herself that her children would never have cause to question whether they were the center of her world. She packed their lunches every morning with small handwritten notes folded inside. Something encouraging. Something funny. Something that said clearly, in words and in the simple act of taking 3 minutes every morning to write it, "I see you. You are loved. You are not invisible to me." She attended every school event, every parent-teacher conference, every Saturday morning soccer game where Deshaun ran up and down that field with total commitment and moderate accuracy, and every recital where Chloe stood in the second row and sang with the focused seriousness of a child who takes every task she is given as genuinely important. Renee made that house feel like a home every single day, not for recognition, not because anyone was watching and evaluating, but because she had been raised in a home that felt like one, and she understood at the most fundamental level that the daily, quiet, uncelebrated work of making people feel safe and loved was not a small thing. It was the main thing. It was the thing that either holds a family together or, when it is withdrawn or destroyed, reveals exactly what the structure beneath it was always made of. The trouble with Marcus did not announce itself. That is the most important thing to understand about how these erosions happen, how a man who once looked at you with genuine admiration and warmth becomes, across years, someone you do not fully recognize. It does not come in one catastrophic moment. It comes in accumulations. In small temperatures. In things that individually seem manageable, explainable, survivable, but which together are building something you cannot yet name because you are too close to it and too invested in it and too honest about the possibility that you yourself might be part of the problem. Marcus had been passed over for a senior project lead position at his firm in year 5 of their marriage. A job he had genuinely expected to get, had told Renee he was going to get, had mentally already begun occupying in the way that people do when they are certain of an outcome. The job went to a colleague 2 years his junior. Marcus did not discuss it. He came home that evening quieter than usual, ate dinner without his normal conversation, and when Renee asked if he was all right, he said he was fine in the specific tone that means the opposite. She gave him space. That was the kind of marriage she believed in, the kind where you give each other room to process without making every silence into a confrontation. She trusted that he would come to her when he was ready. He never came. What happened instead was that the disappointment that had no outlet became something else across the months that followed. It became a low and persistent irritability that attached itself to small things first. A dinner that was too late, a schedule miscommunication, a comment she made in front of friends that he took as undermining. Small things, explainable things, the kind of things that every long-term relationship has. But the temperature was different. Something underneath them was different. And Renee, who had been taught by the most patient man she had ever known to watch what was below the surface of things rather than only what was visible on top, felt it. She felt it the way you feel a weather change before the sky has done anything yet to confirm it. By year 7, the irritability had settled into something harder. A contempt that showed up in the way he responded to her in front of other people. The slight sharpness in his voice when she spoke at gatherings, as though her opinions were mildly embarrassing to him. The way he stopped asking about her work, not in one conversation but across many gradually. Until one day she realized she had not been asked about something she genuinely cared about in several months, and had so normalized the absence of that inquiry that she had stopped expecting it entirely. His mother's name was Gloria Johnson. She lived 40 minutes away in Marietta and had strong opinions about the correct ordering of most things in the universe, and particularly strong opinions about the correct way to be a wife to her son. Gloria had been polite to Renee in the first 2 years of the marriage in the specific way that some women are polite to their sons' wives before they have decided whether they are a permanent fixture or a temporary one. Once she had decided, and Renee was never entirely certain what had shifted the decision, the politeness had given way to something more calculated. Small comments delivered inside pleasantries. Observations about Renee's cooking that arrived wrapped in compliments, but landed as critiques. Questions about finances that were not really questions. Gloria called twice a week, and the calls followed a reliable pattern. She would ask about the grandchildren with genuine warmth, and then, within 2 minutes, find a way to tell Renee something about what she needed to do differently. Renee listened. She said thank you. She hung up. She sat with it. She was a woman who had been taught that dignity was a choice you made in your response to things, not a condition of the things themselves. So she made the choice over and over to remain dignified in the face of a woman who had decided for reasons Renee never fully understood that she simply did not belong. The woman's name was Tanya. Renee did not know her name yet when the knowing first arrived. That is not how it comes. It does not come with a name attached. It comes as a temperature shift in a room you know well. It comes as the specific quality of a phone call ended too quickly when you walk in. It comes in the way a man's body carries itself differently, the slight new self-consciousness of someone performing normalcy for a person who used to require no performance at all. It comes in a cologne that comes home on a shirt collar late on a Tuesday, with an explanation that almost makes sense. Renee felt it for months before she named it, and she named it only to herself, only in the quiet of her own thinking. Because she understood with the clarity of a woman who had watched her grandfather build things in careful silence that naming a thing out loud inside a house with 2 children in it changes the air permanently, and once the air is changed, you cannot make it the same again. So she waited. She watched. She held her compass pendant in her fingers in the kitchen after everyone had gone to sleep, and she breathed, and she thought about what her grandfather had told her about patience and timing and knowing when to move. She was not ready yet, but she was getting ready. It was the second Sunday in October. The kind of morning that comes in Atlanta in the fall with cool air and clean sky and that particular golden light that makes everything look like it has been lit for a photograph. Renee had started cooking at 5, the way she always started cooking on Sundays, the ritual she had kept from her childhood, from those Georgia mornings on Samuel's property when the smell of food meant safety and the sound of family meant belonging. Baked chicken rubbed with a dry seasoning she had developed over years. Rice made with broth instead of water, because that was the way Samuel had always made it, and she had never seen any reason to change it. Collard greens slow-cooked with smoked turkey started before sunrise. Cornbread in the cast iron that still had the particular seasoning of decades of use, and that Renee cleaned and oiled with the same attention she gave to everything she had been trusted with. She had set the table with the white cloth and the proper glasses because Gloria was coming. 9 years of Sunday dinners and 9 years of preparing the table correctly for Marcus's mother, every single time, without exception, not because Gloria had ever acknowledged it, but because Renee was not the kind of woman who let another person's lack of appreciation lower the standard of her own effort. She had dressed the children. She had worn her pearl earrings, the ones she had bought herself the year Chloe was born, as a small act of self-acknowledgement for the work she had done. She had made that house as beautiful and warm as a house can be made. What she did not know, because Marcus had very deliberately not told her, was that he had also invited Tanya. He brought her through the front door at 2:15 in the afternoon with the easy, practiced confidence of a man who had been rehearsing this particular entrance in his head for at least a week. He introduced Tanya to his mother as a colleague from a project he had been working on. And Gloria, who had spent 9 years greeting Renee with the careful warmth of someone rationing an emotion she had decided was being spent on the wrong person, looked at Tanya with an open and immediate welcome that Renee had genuinely never seen directed at herself. It was warm. It was easy. It was the greeting of a woman who recognized something she approved of and was not hiding her approval. Marcus's brothers, Dion and Ray, shook Tanya's hand and fell into easy conversation with her as though this was a normal Sunday and this woman was a normal guest. No one introduced Tanya to Renee. That detail was not an accident. Renee was standing in the kitchen doorway when Tanya came through the front door, and she knew in the first breath. The same cologne. Not similar. Not reminiscent of. The same. She had been smelling that specific scent on her husband's shirts and collars and in the fabric of the passenger seat of his car for 14 months. She stood in that doorway for exactly one breath. She made the only decision available to her that still belonged entirely to herself. She turned back to the kitchen. She plated the food. She carried it to the table. She sat down in the chair nearest the kitchen because Tanya had already settled into her usual seat at the head without anyone asking and without anyone saying a single word to redirect her. Marcus sat beside Tanya and unfolded his napkin with the satisfaction of a man who believes he has arranged something perfectly. The dinner began. Gloria made conversation. Tanya spoke the way certain people speak at tables that are not theirs, too freely, too easily, with the casual authority of someone performing a familiarity they have not earned. She laughed at things that were not quite funny enough to warrant the size of the laugh. She helped herself to seconds before Renee had finished her firsts. She commented on the food the way a satisfied hotel guest comments on room service, appreciatively, but with no acknowledgement whatsoever of the woman sitting across from her who had been cooking since 5 in the morning to produce it. Renee kept her eyes moving between her plate and the faces of her children. Chloe, 11 now, was watching her mother with the focused, reading attention of a child who has learned to use her mother's face as the primary instrument for determining whether the world is safe. Her eyes moved between Renee's face and Tanya's and back again with a steadiness that broke Renee's heart quietly and completely. Deshawn, 9, had gone silent in the specific way that little boys go silent when something is wrong that they do not have language for yet. Jaw tight. Eyes down. Fork moving but not really eating. Renee kept her expression clear. Not the performance of calm, the real thing, the thing she had spent years building, not because she did not feel anything, but because she had learned through hard experience that showing emotion in that room only ever handed people something they did not deserve to have. The particular moment that brought everything into focus came 30 minutes into the meal. Renee mentioned, keeping her voice light and without any edge at all, that Deshawn had a major school presentation that Friday. Something he had been working on for 3 weeks with a genuine investment that had made both his parents proud when they had still been the kind of parents who talked about such things together. She said she needed Marcus to be home by 5 so they could both attend. It was a reasonable request. It was the kind of thing parents say to each other at dinner tables every day in houses across this country. Before Marcus could respond, Tanya leaned forward across that table and said that Friday was not going to work because she and Marcus already had plans. She said it in the pleasant, conversational tone of someone delivering scheduling information, as though the existence of her plans was simply a logistical fact that Renee would of course want to factor in. The silence at that table was total. Renee looked at Marcus. Directly, quietly, with the eyes of a woman waiting to see who her husband would choose to be in this moment. Marcus laughed. The short, dismissive laugh of a man performing something for an audience. He said Tanya was right, that they had plans he could not move, that maybe Renee could find someone else to cover the school thing. The way you might ask someone to pick up dry cleaning. Gloria said without looking up from her plate that a person had to be flexible. Then she looked at Tanya and offered a small, private smile that communicated a kind of shared understanding that predated this dinner by some months at least. Dion looked at his plate. Ray reached for more cornbread. Neither of them said one word that acknowledged what had just been done, at a table with 2 children sitting at it, to their mother. Renee felt something move through her chest in that moment. Not anger. She knew her anger well enough by now to recognize it when it came, and this was not it. This was something colder and more final. The feeling of a door being pulled shut from the inside by someone who has made a decision they are not going to revisit. Under the table, a small hand found hers. Chloe's fingers, quiet and certain, curling around her mother's palm without a word, just holding on. Renee closed her hand around her daughter's and held it gently, and she kept her face clear, and she breathed, the way Samuel had taught her to breathe when the thing you are managing is larger than what the room can hold. And then Marcus leaned forward, low and deliberate. His voice dropped just enough to perform intimacy while ensuring the entire table could hear every word. The voice of a man who had been planning this specific moment for longer than just this afternoon. He looked at his wife and he said, each word carefully placed, "Go ahead. Call her ma'am." No one at that table breathed. Renee looked at Chloe first. Looked at the tightness around her daughter's eyes, the careful, controlled effort of a child working very hard not to react in a way that would make things worse. She looked at Deshawn, whose jaw was set in the way that 9-year-old boys set their jaws when they are trying to be what they think they need to be even though they are not yet old enough to know what that is. She looked at Gloria, whose expression held the patient stillness of someone who helped plan the moment and was now simply waiting to see it completed. She looked at Dion and Ray, who were studying their plates with the focused attention of men who have decided that the most strategic thing available to them is to see nothing. She looked at Tanya, who was sitting with a small half-smile on her face that had nothing gracious in it at all. And then she looked at Marcus. Her husband. The man she had believed in when believing in him was worth the investment of her faith. She looked at his face, and what she found there was not cruelty, not exactly. It was satisfaction. He was satisfied. He was proud of the arrangement he had assembled. He had constructed this moment with care and intention, and he was enjoying the product of his construction. In the space between 1 second and the next, with her daughter's hand in hers, Renee thought about a man on a wooden porch in Georgia who had told her once in that slow, unhurried voice she could still hear perfectly that the quietest one is usually the most ready. She turned back to Marcus. She looked at him with eyes that held no anger, no tears, no fear, and no performance. Clear eyes. Free eyes. The eyes of a woman who had already received a phone call 3 days ago that had rearranged the entire structure of the world these people believed they were living in. And she said it. Softly. Evenly. Without any performance at all. Yes, ma'am. Tanya smiled wide. Gloria lifted her glass. Marcus leaned back in his chair with the expression of a man who just won something important. Not one of them, not one person at that table, heard the phone on the kitchen counter vibrate twice. Not one of them saw Renee's eyes travel to it for exactly 1 second from across the room, just long enough to confirm the name on the screen. Carter and Associates. She would return that call after the children were in bed. To understand what was waiting for Renee on the other side of that phone call, you have to understand Samuel Washington in the fullness of who he was, not the version of him visible on the surface. Not the modest man in worn work boots driving a 16-year-old truck down red Georgia roads, but the full, complete, 50-year project of what he had been building beneath the surface of that ordinary visible life. Samuel had grown up in Liberty County, Georgia, the son of a man who had worked other people's land his entire life and had died with nothing to leave behind but the instruction that his children should do differently, that they should find a way, no matter what the world arranged around them to prevent it, to own something. His family's story was one repeated across hundreds of Black families in coastal Georgia, ancestors who had gone through immense sacrifice specifically so that the next generation would have something, so they would not have to go through as much. Samuel had taken that instruction and made it his entire life's work. He bought his first 8 acres in 1968 when he was 29 years old, and the world around him was arranged with considerable hostility toward exactly this kind of transaction. Black families across the South had been purchasing land and passing it through generations, sometimes informally, understanding that the formal systems around them had been designed with their exclusion built in. Samuel trusted no informal process. He had a lawyer from the very beginning. He had documentation for everything. He had worked with the Carter and Associates firm in Atlanta from his very first land purchase, because he understood with the clarity of a man who has studied his own history that the protection of what you build requires the same rigor as the building itself. He expanded year by year, following the example of Black landowners across the South who understood that land ownership meant real power and real self-sufficiency. He never stopped acquiring and never stopped protecting what he had acquired. He made investments in small businesses across Georgia and the Carolinas, the kinds of investments that required patience measured not in quarters, but in decades. He never spoke about money. Not at church, not at the dinner table, not at any gathering where the information might travel to ears that had no business receiving it. He had a strict and absolute policy, developed early and never deviated from, that the full picture of what he had built would be shared with exactly one person, at exactly the right moment, and that moment had not yet come. The right person was always Renee. He had known it since she was small, since the early years when she came to live with him after Celestine passed, and he watched this child process grief with a steadiness that seemed to come from somewhere older and deeper than her years. She had her mother's eyes and her grandmother's backbone and something that was entirely her own, a quality of attention, a capacity for patience, a way of understanding that some things required waiting for, and that the waiting itself was not a failure but a strategy. He had been preparing her for the inheritance her entire life without using those words. Every lesson about patience, every conversation about land, every time he pressed that compass into her palm and reminded her that a person who knows their direction does not need to announce where they are going. He was telling her something. He had always been telling her something. In the last 2 years of his life, when he was 90 and moving more slowly through the world, but no less precisely, he had made a series of phone calls to Carter and Associates that finalized arrangements he had been planning for nearly a decade. He had observed, during Renee's last several visits to Savannah, something in the quality of her silence that told him what she had not said aloud. He had watched the way she held her shoulders when Marcus's name came up. He had watched the way she deflected certain questions with a brightness that was just slightly too deliberate to be entirely real. He had seen it the way a man sees things when he has spent 60 years paying the kind of attention to the people he loves that most people only manage for a few months at the beginning of things. He did not ask her about it directly. He trusted her to handle what she was handling. He had taught her how to handle things. What he did instead was protect her, the only way he knew how, quietly, completely, and in advance. He called his attorney. He reviewed every document in the portfolio. He added a legal protection clause to the estate plan that was specific, comprehensive, and written with a thoroughness that reflected 35 years of partnership with a firm that understood exactly what was at stake. The clause stated, in language that left no room for interpretation or contest, that no spouse, by marriage, by legal claim, by any instrument or argument available under the law, could access, attach to, contest, or in any way benefit from any portion of the estate. The protection was absolute. Samuel had seen what was coming before Renee had been willing to name it, and he had arranged for her not to face it alone. The last time Renee saw him alive, he was lying in a hospital bed in Savannah, looking smaller than she had ever seen him, smaller than seemed right for a man who had always seemed so permanent, so entirely fixed in the world that his absence from it was genuinely difficult to imagine. He had held her hands in both of his, the way he had always held her hands, large and calloused and warm, and he had looked at her face for a long moment without saying anything at all. Then he had said it simply and completely, the way he said everything that mattered. Everything is taken care of, baby girl. All of it. You hear me? Everything. She had cried and held his hands and assumed he meant the property, the modest savings, the arrangements for the house and the land that she already knew about from her visits over the years. She did not ask what he meant. She was too busy trying to memorize the weight and warmth of his hands holding hers, trying to press the feeling permanently into her body so that she would always be able to return to it. Samuel Washington passed away 3 weeks later on a Wednesday morning in late November, and the world became a quieter and more serious place without him in it. He had been 91 years old. He had built something that would last 100 more. Renee had not been expecting it. She had known, in the way that you know general things, that there would be some form of estate communication from Carter and Associates following Samuel's passing, the land she was already aware of. The house in Savannah she had assumed she would inherit along with the responsibility of maintaining it. She had not been preparing herself for anything larger than that. She had been managing her own household, managing her marriage's deterioration, managing the daily and unrelenting work of being the emotional infrastructure of 2 children whose world was becoming increasingly unstable. And she had simply not had the mental room to anticipate anything beyond what she could already see. The call came on a Thursday afternoon in October, 3 days before the Sunday dinner. She was in the kitchen putting together a grocery list when her phone buzzed on the counter with an Atlanta number she recognized as Carter and Associates. She picked up. The attorney on the line identified himself as James Carter III, the grandson of the man Samuel had first worked with in 1968 and now the senior partner of the firm that had protected Samuel's interests for over 3 decades. He said he had been trying to reach her for several weeks following the estate documentation process and apologized for the delays in communication. He said he had some things he needed to go over with her and asked if she had a few minutes. She sat down at the kitchen table. She said she did. The call lasted 4 minutes and 11 seconds. James Carter III was a man who had clearly delivered significant information many times in his professional life because he delivered it with the careful, measured pacing of someone who understands that a human mind needs a moment between large pieces of information to process and reorganize before it can receive the next one. He began with the land holdings, which were more extensive than Renee had understood, parcels across Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Tennessee, Mississippi, and North Carolina. Accumulated across 50 years and now valued at a figure that was itself already extraordinary before he got to the rest of it. Then he moved to the investment portfolio, the quiet stakes in small companies that Samuel had accumulated over decades and that had compounded through those decades with the patient certainty that Samuel had applied to everything. Then he gave her the total. Renee did not speak for a moment after he said it. She was sitting at her kitchen table with her hand flat on the wood surface and her mind doing something she could not describe as thinking exactly, more like a radical and total reorganization of every assumption she had been living inside of. $35 million. Left entirely and unconditionally and irrevocably to her alone. She asked him to repeat it. He did. He then told her about the protection clause, explaining it in clear and specific terms, that no person connected to her by marriage or by claim had any access to or legal standing regarding any portion of the estate, that this protection had been specifically and deliberately arranged, that it was airtight, and that it had been prepared with exactly this kind of scenario in mind. He paused after that last part. She understood what he meant by it. When the call ended, she sat in her kitchen for a long time in the silence of a house that had stopped feeling like hers years before she had been willing to say so, and she held the brass compass pendant in her fingers, warm from her skin, smooth from 30 years of being held in moments exactly like this one. She said one thing, quietly, to no one and to everything at once. She said, "Thank you, Grandpa." Then she wiped her face, got up, started the greens for Sunday, and began to think about what came next. What happened between the Thursday phone call and the Sunday dinner was that Renee learned, the way she had always learned things that mattered, by staying quiet and paying attention. She had not told Marcus about the call. She had not told anyone. She had gone about the following 2 days with the surface calm of a woman managing an ordinary week, cooking, getting the children to school, answering Gloria's Wednesday call with the same steady politeness she always brought to it. But something inside her had settled. The particular quality of her stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of a woman enduring. It was the stillness of a woman who has already made a decision and is simply waiting for the sequence of events around that decision to catch up. She had sat with the numbers, and with the implications, and with the full weight of what Samuel had arranged for her. She had also sat with something harder and more personal, the understanding that her grandfather had seen what was happening in her marriage before she had been willing to see it herself, and had moved in advance to protect her from consequences she had not yet fully acknowledged were coming. That was the thing that undid her in the quiet of those 2 nights before Sunday. Not the money, not the scale of what he had built. The fact that he had loved her that specifically. That he had watched and understood and acted, without saying a word that would embarrass her or press her before she was ready, without making her feel like her private pain was visible and therefore diminished. He had simply protected her. The way he had protected her every day of her life since she was 6 years old. She had not yet known, on the Thursday of the call, about the family meeting that had taken place without her 3 weeks earlier. She found out about it the way she found out about most things, by being present and paying attention when people who underestimated her spoke too freely in her vicinity. Gloria had organized it. Marcus and his brothers present. The stated subject was financial clarity. The real subject, which became clear within 5 minutes of Renee piecing together the conversation she had overheard fragments of and the comments Marcus had made in passing without realizing she had assembled them, was the house. They had discussed restructuring the mortgage, moving it formally into Marcus's name for what Gloria had apparently called clarity and protection going forward. Dion had agreed it made sense. Ray had agreed it made sense. Marcus had agreed without apparently having spent 1 minute verifying what he would have confirmed immediately if he had looked at the original mortgage documents still filed in the gray folder on Renee's shelf. The house had been in Renee's name since the day they signed for it 9 years ago. It had always been hers. Not because of any strategic arrangement, not because she had seen this coming, but because of a Tuesday evening and a cleaner credit score and a practical decision made without drama over takeout containers pushed to one side of the dining room table. They had spent an entire meeting planning to take something from her that had never been theirs to take. She did not say any of this when she found out. She filed it where she filed all important information. In the quiet, in the still, in the private country inside her where the real thinking happened and where Samuel's voice still lived, patient and unhurried, reminding her that the loudest ones are usually the most afraid. Carter and Associates had been handling Samuel Washington's estate with the same thoroughness and discretion that had defined their 35-year relationship with him, and when it came time for the formal estate reading, they arranged it with the dignity that Samuel's legacy deserved. It was held on a Thursday evening at a private event space in downtown Atlanta, a quiet and well-appointed room that smelled of old wood and good leather, and the particular serious calm of spaces where important things are routinely decided. Renee had told no one. She had dressed carefully in a simple dark dress. She wore her pearl earrings. She wore the brass compass pendant outside her shirt for the first time in her adult life, visible, resting at the base of her throat against her collarbone where it had lived for 30 years, but always hidden, always private, always her secret and Samuel's. She kissed her children. She told the sitter she would be back by 9. She drove herself to Atlanta in the quiet of that Thursday evening feeling something she recognized, after a long time of not feeling it, as the particular calm of a person moving precisely in the direction their compass has been pointing. She did not know that Gloria had been watching her more carefully than usual in the days since the Sunday dinner. She did not know that something in Renee's new quality of stillness had made Marcus's mother uneasy enough that she had called her son that Thursday afternoon and told him to follow his wife. And so Marcus arrived at the event space 20 minutes after Renee did, with Tanya beside him and Gloria on his arm, moving through the door with the combined energy of people who believe they have a right to be somewhere they were not invited to. The room held a collection of extended family members, community figures who had known Samuel in life, and a few individuals who had done business with him across the years. Most of them had modest expectations of what the evening would produce. Samuel had not been a man who displayed wealth, and the people who knew him had calibrated their expectations accordingly. There was polite conversation and the low, comfortable hum of people waiting for something they expected to be meaningful but not dramatic. Renee was already seated near the front. She heard the door open behind her when Marcus and his party arrived. She did not turn around. A member of Carter and Associates staff redirected Marcus and his group quietly to seats in the back of the room. Marcus sat down. Gloria beside him. Tanya beside Gloria. The three of them in a row with versions of the same confused impatience on their faces, the impatience of people who are accustomed to being at the center of rooms and are being asked, by a room that has not acknowledged their arrival, to sit in the back and wait. James Carter III entered and the ambient conversation dissolved without him having to ask it to. He was a tall man in a well-made suit with the particular quiet confidence of someone who has spent a career being trusted with things that genuinely matter and has learned to let that gravity speak for itself without amplification. He opened his portfolio and he began. He started with Samuel. He talked about him the way you talk about someone you actually knew. Not a performance of tribute, not a recitation of dates and achievements, but a genuine accounting of a man. He talked about the land purchases of 1968 and what those purchases had required in terms of courage given the specific conditions of that time. Like the black landowners and families of that era who had bought land a generation removed from the most brutal period of American history, Samuel's early purchases represented exactly the kind of stubborn, forward-looking courage that many people alive today would struggle to fully appreciate. He talked about the decades of patient reinvestment, the compounding of careful decisions made year over year with a horizon measured in generations rather than quarters. He talked about the private stakes in small businesses, the land holdings across 6 southern states, the portfolio built with the consistency of a man who never once confused the urgency of the present moment with the importance of the long view. The room was quiet at first with the respectful quiet of an audience receiving a tribute. Then the quality of the silence shifted as the scope of the numbers began to surface. A different quality of attention came into the room. Something tighter. Something adjusting. Renee sat still. She did not look back. She held the compass pendant in her fingers, warm from her skin, smooth from decades of exactly this kind of holding. She breathed. In the back of the room, she heard Gloria shift in her seat. She heard Marcus's breathing change. James Carter III set down one page and picked up the next. He did not dramatize what he was about to read. He simply read it. The entirety of the estate, across all properties, all holdings, and all assets, had been formally valued at $35 million. That total was left unconditionally, irrevocably, and with no restrictions attached, to his granddaughter, Renee Marie Washington Johnson. The silence that arrived in that room was not polite silence. It was not the respectful hush of an audience receiving expected information. It was the silence of a room full of people whose fundamental understanding of the situation they were sitting in had just been dismantled and rebuilt in a completely different shape in less time than it takes to draw a breath. Someone 3 rows back made a small involuntary sound. In the back of the room, the sound of a chair being gripped. Renee did not move. Carter then produced the second document, the protection clause, and explained it with the same unhurried clarity he had brought to everything else. No spouse. No legal claim. No instrument or argument available under any jurisdiction. The protection was absolute and it was permanent, and it had been specifically arranged. He paused on that last point just long enough for its meaning to complete itself in the understanding of everyone present. Marcus stood up from the back of the room. His voice, when it came, was stripped of the confidence it normally carried, left with just the raw and exposed sound of a man whose foundation has disappeared beneath him without warning. He said Renee's name. Then he said it again. He started moving through the seated rows toward the front. Carter's staff moved to intercept him quietly and firmly. Renee turned around for the first time since entering that room. She looked at Marcus fully, without anger, without grief, without any of the visible devastation that a man who had humiliated his wife at her own dinner table 7 days earlier might reasonably expect to see from her in this moment. She looked at him with eyes that were completely clear. The eyes of a woman who had already done everything she needed to do in the private country of her own kitchen in the small hours of nights when no one was watching. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Then she turned back to the front of the room. She asked Mr. Carter where she needed to sign. She signed. She stood. She held the compass at her throat for 1 moment. And she walked out into the Atlanta night with the particular unhurried certainty of a person who knows exactly where they are going. The weeks that followed the estate reading had the quality that real endings almost always have, which is nothing like the endings that people imagine when they imagine endings. There was no screaming in public. There was no dramatic confrontation in a parking lot or a final scene where everything that had been unsaid was finally delivered in one complete and satisfying speech. There was instead the quiet, thorough, structural dismantling of an arrangement that had lost its reason to stand. Marcus's attorney called Carter and Associates within the week. The conversation was brief. The protection clause was untouchable. There was no angle, no legal argument, no instrument that could reach what Samuel had arranged to be unreachable. Whatever proximity to the estate Marcus had imagined he held by virtue of being Renee's husband, it had never been real, and it was not real now, and there was nothing available to make it real. He attempted to speak with Renee directly. He came to the house that had always been in her name. A detail his attorney had by this point discovered with the particular silent reaction of a professional person absorbing information that changes the entire character of the case they believed they were working on. Marcus stood on the porch of a house he had lived in for 9 years, not knowing it had never been his, looking smaller than Renee had ever seen a man look who had recently been performing the size of a winner at his own kitchen table. She opened the door. She looked at him without anger, and without cruelty, and without any emotion that she had not already processed entirely on her own time. She handed him an envelope from Carter and Associates outlining the legal terms of their separation. She closed the door gently, not a slam, just the quiet and definitive pull of a door shut by someone who is finished with something and has a great deal left to do. Gloria called twice after that. The first call Renee answered and listened to for 2 minutes before saying, calmly and without any particular feeling, that she thought it was best if they gave each other some space, and that she would always make sure the children had access to their grandmother within the boundaries that a healthy arrangement allowed. She said it the way Samuel said important things, clearly, without excess, with no invitation to negotiate. The second call she did not answer. Tanya was gone before the month ended. She had not, as far as anyone could later confirm, said any particular dramatic goodbye to Marcus or arranged any particular exit. She had simply stopped returning his calls, the way a practical person stops investing in a situation when the underlying premise of the investment has been removed. The scaffolding she had been standing on had been the imagined proximity to a married man's access to something she had believed was coming. When that belief was removed, there was nothing else. Marcus found himself in a 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur that took most of what his salary could carry. With a career that had spent years stagnating and a reputation in the professional and social circles they had shared that had quietly absorbed the nature of what had happened at the estate reading and adjusted itself accordingly. He was not ruined in any dramatic or visible way. He was diminished. In the ways that matter most, and in none of the ways that can be appealed. Dion and Ray said nothing publicly. There was nothing to say. They had been present at a family meeting where they had agreed to help plan the taking of property that was never available to be taken, and the legal conversation that followed the estate reading had made the implications of their participation in that meeting quite clear quite quickly. The silence from both of them was thorough, and it was permanent. Gloria faced something quieter and in some ways more lasting than anything legal. Chloe and Deshawn were children who had been paying close attention for a long time, and children who have been paying close attention for a long time are not easily misled about what they have witnessed. Renee never said one word against their father or their grandmother in front of them. Not one word. She had been taught by a man who built his entire life without ever needing to explain his enemies to understand that the quality of your own conduct speaks in a register that no amount of narrating other people's failures ever reaches. But Chloe and Deshawn had been at that Sunday dinner table. They had seen what was done to their mother. They had felt Renee's hand holding Chloe's under the table. They had watched their father lean forward and say what he said in the voice he used for an audience. The warmth they had previously given their grandmother automatically, the unearned warmth of children who have not yet had cause to apply conditions to their affection, became something different. Not cold. Just careful. Calibrated. The consequence of choices made by an adult who had believed that children were not paying close enough attention to require the cost to be factored in. 6 months after the estate transfer was complete, Renee's life looked nothing like it had at that Sunday dinner table in October, and everything like the life that a certain wooden porch in Georgia had been preparing her for since she was 6 years old. The house was hers in the way it had always been legally hers, but had not felt like for years, fully and peacefully and without the ambient weight of another person's contempt living in its rooms. She had repainted the kitchen the color she had always wanted it, a deep warm terracotta that caught the morning light through the east window and made the room feel like the inside of something that was alive and generous. She had moved her reading chair to the corner where it could face the garden that Chloe had taken over completely with the same focused, serious ambition that she brought to everything that mattered to her, planning in a notebook, planting in deliberate rows. Approaching the whole project as though it were genuinely important work, which Renee had told her more than once, looking directly into her daughter's eyes, it absolutely was. Deshawn had started a community youth basketball program on Saturday mornings with a level of organizational energy that his coach described to Renee at pickup one afternoon as honestly a little alarming for a 9-year-old. Renee had smiled all the way home. The foundation had been her first act. She had incorporated it 8 weeks after the estate transfer, moving quickly and deliberately, the way Samuel had moved when he was building something that mattered. She had named it the Samuel Foundation. Not for monument, not for the performance of grief or tribute, but because she wanted every piece of work the foundation did to carry his name forward into territory he had always meant for it to reach. Like the Black families across coastal Georgia and the broader American South who had spent generations fighting to hold onto ancestral land because their ancestors had sacrificed so much to acquire it, Samuel had built something intended specifically for the people who came after him. Renee understood her responsibility as the person who received what he built to be the extension of that original intention outward. The foundation focused on land acquisition assistance for Black families across the South, on exactly the work Samuel had begun with a single Georgia parcel in 1968 and expanded for 50 years with the patience of a man who understood that the real measure of what you build is not what you have while you are alive, but what survives you and grows after you are gone. In the tradition of families and collectives across the South who had been purchasing land to build generational wealth and create something real and lasting for their communities, the foundation operated with the understanding that land ownership was not merely a financial matter, but a foundational one. It also provided educational resources on wealth protection, on exactly the legal arrangements Samuel had used, so that the next family with something worth protecting would understand how to protect it before the moment of threat rather than after. She had a team. People who were genuinely good at what they did and who understood what the work was for. She managed the foundation the way Samuel had managed everything, patiently, with her eyes on the decade rather than the quarter, with the understanding that visible impact at scale was the product of invisible consistency over time. She did not make announcements about her wealth. She did not purchase things to be seen purchasing. She lived in the house with the terracotta kitchen and the garden Chloe was slowly taking over and the front porch that caught the Georgia evening light at a particular angle that made the whole yard look like a painting for about 20 minutes every day around 6. If you were there to see it, and Renee made sure she was there to see it as often as she possibly could. She still drove the children to school every morning. She still packed handwritten notes in their lunch bags, because some things are not practices you stop doing when the circumstances around them change. Some things are simply who you are. She still cooked on Sunday mornings, the whole ritual, the herbs from the kitchen windowsill, the cast iron cornbread, the slow greens from before sunrise. Not because anyone required it of her, but because it connected her to something she had no interest in being disconnected from. The smell of that food on a Sunday morning was the smell of Samuel's house. It was the smell of safety. It was the smell of belonging. It would be the smell her children associated with the home they grew up in, and decades from now, when they were grown, It would be the smell that brought them back to themselves when the world tried to pull them away from who they were. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. One evening in late spring, a Thursday, nothing particular about it. She was sitting on the porch with Deshawn beside her working through his homework and Chloe cross-legged in the garden below making notes in her planning notebook with the focused intensity of a child who has decided that her garden is a serious undertaking, requiring serious documentation. The sky had gone that deep pink and gold that Georgia evenings produce when they are being generous, when the light comes through the tops of the pecan trees at the angle that makes everything look warm and possible and like the world has decided. Just for these 20 minutes, to be gentle with you. Renee reached up and held the brass compass pendant between her fingers. She held it the way she had always held it, the way she had been holding it since she was 10 years old on another porch in another Georgia evening with an enormous, calloused hand wrapped around hers, and a voice that was unhurried and certain, saying things that would take her years to fully understand. The compass was warm from her skin. It was smooth from 30 years of being held in exactly this way and exactly the kinds of moments when something important needed to be remembered. She thought about Samuel. About the slow, complete, invisible certainty of what he had built. About the courage it had taken, decade after decade, to keep building without any audience, without any external validation, without any guarantee that the world he was arranging for the person he loved most would arrive exactly when she needed it to. She thought about what it meant to love someone that specifically. Not generally, not as a category, but specifically. To watch them, to understand what they were carrying, to move in advance of the moment they needed protection, to do all of it in the quiet, in the background, with no requirement that you be thanked or seen or understood while you were doing it. She thought about a Sunday in October when a man had leaned across a table and asked her to lower herself in front of her own children, believing that the arrangement of that room gave him the authority to make that request. She thought about how small that room had been, how certain everyone in it had been, how completely wrong. She did not feel anger about it. She had moved through the anger a long time ago, alone in her kitchen in the small hours, the way real things get processed, privately and completely and without an audience. What she felt now, sitting on this porch with her children, with the Georgia evening doing what it does at its most generous, was something she was still learning to fully inhabit. Something spacious. Something that felt, on evenings like this one, like peace in its most specific form. Not the absence of pain. Something more earned than that. The knowledge that the pain had not made her into what it wanted to make her. That she was still, after all of it, entirely herself. That the compass her grandfather had pressed into her palm on a porch that smelled like pecan trees and slow greens had been pointing at this, at exactly this, for 30 years. She smiled. Not the performance of a smile, not something arranged for anyone watching. The quiet, private kind. The kind that belongs entirely to yourself and to the people who shaped you and who continue to live in the best of what you do long after they are gone from the rooms where you used to find them. She held that compass in her fingers against the warmth of the Georgia evening, and she let herself rest inside the knowledge of what she carried, and what had been carried for her, and what she would now carry forward. For Chloe in her garden and Deshawn in his homework, and all the families the foundation would reach, and all the children of those families who would one day sit on their own porches, not knowing the full name of everything that had been arranged for them before they were old enough to ask for it. Some people will look at a woman's silence and call it weakness. They will look at the way she absorbs things without fracturing and conclude that she is someone who can be arranged, someone who can be placed and moved and asked to lower herself on command. But a woman who knows what she carries, a woman who has been taught by someone great how to hold the real weight of real things without announcing it, does not need to prove anything to people who are never going to see her anyway. She only needs to know her direction. She only needs to hold the compass. She only needs to wait. And when the moment comes, it always comes. Nothing in that room will ever be the same again. This has been Loveth Reveals, where the truth always comes out. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And we will see you in the next one.